The valley was silent in the way only death permits. Somewhere beneath the ridgeline, 6 Navy SEALs crouched behind crumbling mud walls that wouldn't stop a determined rifle round, let alone the mortars that had been walking closer for the past 11 minutes. Staff Sergeant Marcus Holt pressed his back against the clay, feeling each impact through his spine like a countdown. His radio crackled with the kind of static that meant someone far away was deciding whether they were worth saving. The Taliban had them triangulated and everyone knew it. The QRF was 40 minutes out. Apache were refueling. Fast movers were committed to a strike package near Kandahar. The list of reasons why help wasn't coming grew longer with each breath Holt took, each one tasting like copper and dust. His spotter, Rodriguez, hadn't spoken in 3 minutes, just kept checking his magazine count like a man counting his remaining heartbeats. They'd been compromised from the start. Bad intel, worse luck. The high-value target they'd been tracking had walked them straight into a horseshoe ambush with all the elegance of a mousetrap. Now the enemy owned the high ground, the tree line, and the only road out. Holt keyed his radio one more time, voice leveled despite everything. Any station, Reaper 6. We are danger close and taking effective fire from 3 sides. Request immediate CAS over. The response came from a voice he didn't recognize, female, calm as Sunday morning. Reaper 6, Hog 1-1. I'm 8 mics out, solo package, bringing the party. Authenticate Bravo 29er. Holt's eyes met Rodriguez's. Solo package, 1 aircraft, no escort. He could hear the disbelief in his own voice. Hog 1-1, authenticate Bravo 29er, but be advised we have multiple technical vehicles and at least 40 fighters in prepared positions. Recommend you wait for Reaper 6. I didn't copy that last part. Going off-road. Keep your heads down. The transmission ended. Rodriguez finally spoke, his voice flat. Solo A-10, no JTAC, no escort. We're gonna die watching someone else get a medal. But 8 minutes later they heard it. Not the scream of jets or the whump of rotors, but something older, meaner. A sound like God clearing his throat. The A-10 Thunderbolt came in low over the southern ridge, so low Holt could see the paint chipped on its nose cone, the scorched titanium bathtub protecting the pilot, the 7-barrel Gatling gun slung beneath like a promise. It wasn't graceful. It didn't need to be. The aircraft moved with brutal efficiency, wings heavy with ordnance, twin engines roaring defiance. Whoever was flying had the throttle wide open, and the stick pulled into what looked like a gun run before she'd even radioed her position. The first burst from the GAU-8 was a sound Holt felt in his teeth, a mechanical roar that turned a technical truck into scrap metal and memory in less than 2 seconds. 30mm rounds chewed through the vehicle, through the men around it, through the wall behind them. The A-10 banked hard, pulling a turn so tight Holt could see the pilot's helmet through the canopy, and then she was coming back around for another pass. No hesitation, no request for clearance, just violence delivered with surgical precision. The enemy mortars fell silent, not because they'd retreated, but because they were trying to track a target that flew like it was angry. Captain Eliza, Junkyard Dalton, had learned to fly in the kind of poverty that taught you how to fix things that shouldn't work and make them sing. She'd grown up in a Kentucky hollow where money was scarce but pride was abundant, where her father rebuilt car engines on their front porch and told her that anything mechanical could be understood if you weren't afraid to get your hands dirty. By 16, she'd rebuilt a Cessna 150 from salvage parts. By 23, she was flying A-10s. Now, at 31, she was 8 minutes into what would either be a textbook close air support mission or a career-ending mistake, and she didn't particularly care which. The SEALs on the ground needed her more than she needed approval. She'd copied their position, marked the enemy concentrations on her mental map, and committed to the run before anyone at headquarters could tell her to wait for proper coordination. The A-10 shuddered as she squeezed the trigger again, the GAU-8 spinning up with a sound like industrial death. Her targeting pod painted a second technical vehicle, and she walked the rounds right through it, watching through her HUD as men scattered like ants from a kicked hill. Good. Let them scatter. Let them feel what the SEALs had felt for the past 15 minutes. She pulled up hard, feeling the GS press her into the seat, and rolled right to set up for a rocket pass. Her wingman was supposed to be here. Lieutenant Vickers had aborted with a hydraulic issue 20 minutes ago, leaving her to fly the mission alone. Standard procedure said to return to base. Standard procedure could go to hell. Dalton's radio crackled. Hog 1-1, this is Reaper 6. You are cleared hot on the eastern tree line. Danger close 50 meters. She didn't bother acknowledging. They'd see her answer. The rockets came off the rails in pairs, streaking toward the tree line in trails of smoke and fury. They impacted with precision that came from hundreds of hours in the simulator and the kind of instinct you can't teach. Dalton watched the explosions blossom through her canopy, already calculating the next pass. The A-10 wasn't fast, wasn't pretty, but it was hers, and right now it was the only thing standing between 6 Americans and a shallow grave in the Hindu Kush. She checked her fuel. Enough for 3 more passes, maybe 4 if she pushed it. The voice in her headset belonged to a man who'd stopped questioning and started believing. Hog 1-1, direct hit. Enemy forces withdrawing north. You just saved our lives. Dalton's response was clipped, professional. Reaper 6, I've got ordnance and attitude remaining. Point me where you need me. But inside, something settled in her chest. This was why she flew. Not for the medals or the recognition. She had neither and expected neither. But for moments like this, when being in the right place with the right weapons meant someone's family wouldn't get a folded flag. She'd grown up watching her mother wait for her father to come home from the mine each day, watching that particular fear that lived in the eyes of women who loved dangerous men. Now she was the dangerous one, and she carried that responsibility like gospel. The A-10 came around again, lower this time, and Dalton's eyes scanned for targets. The Taliban had regrouped near a compound 300 meters north, trying to reorganize their retreat into something resembling a fighting withdrawal. Dalton could see them through her targeting pod, thermal signatures clustered around what looked like a mortar position. They were still trying to kill the SEALs, still trying to finish what they'd started. She armed the Mavericks and locked the target. The missile dropped clean, motor igniting a heartbeat later, and she watched it track true all the way to impact. The compound disappeared in a cloud of dust and fire. When it cleared, the mortar position was gone, just gone, like it had never existed. The radio chatter from the ground was picking up now relief, gratitude, the kind of voices men use when they realize they're going to see tomorrow. But Dalton wasn't listening. She was flying the aircraft, managing systems, scanning for threats. The mission wasn't over until she was wheels down at Bagram, and even then she'd have to explain why she'd violated about 6 different protocols to be here. Her squadron commander was going to have words, lots of words, probably official words that went into her jacket. She didn't care. She'd made peace with the consequences before she'd pushed the throttle forward. Some things mattered more than careers. The A-10 climbed slowly, gaining altitude, and Dalton allowed herself 1 moment to breathe. 1 moment to feel the weight of what had just happened. Back at Bagram Air Base, the operations center had been watching the entire engagement through a Predator feed, and the silence in the room was the kind that follows miracles or disasters. Nobody was quite sure which. Major Colin Rains stood with his arms crossed, watching a single A-10 prosecute targets that should have required a 4-ship package and a full JTAC coordination. His jaw was tight. Captain Dalton had violated direct orders to hold position, had flown into a hot LZ without support, had employed weapons without proper clearance. She'd also just saved 6 SEALs from certain death, and the gun camera footage was going to be shown at every CAS training brief for the next decade. The contradiction sat heavy in the room. "Get Hog 1-1 on the horn," Rains said quietly. "I want her flight path, her fuel state, and her explanation. In that order." But his voice lacked conviction. Everyone in that room knew they'd just watched something special. The radio operator nodded, already keying up the frequency. On the ground, Holt was pulling his team back toward the extraction point, moving fast while the enemy was still disorganized. He could hear the circling overhead, a guardian angel made of titanium and depleted uranium. Rodriguez kept looking up at the sky like he was seeing God. Maybe he was. Who the hell flies like that? Rodriguez said finally. Holt shook his head. Someone who doesn't care about making colonel. The extraction went smooth. The QRF showed up 18 minutes later to an LZ that was secure, quiet, and littered with the kind of destruction that made grown men whisper. Holt climbed into the Chinook and immediately asked for the pilot's name. He was told Captain Dalton, call sign Junkyard, Solo A-10 out of Bagram. He committed it to memory. When they landed, he'd find her. When he found her, he'd say thank you. And then he'd ask why someone that good was flying alone. The Chinook lifted off, rotor wash kicking up dust, and Holt watched the valley recede below. Somewhere up there, Junkyard was turning for home, low on fuel and probably low on patience for the paperwork that was coming. He hoped she knew what she'd done. He hoped someone would tell her. The flight back to Bagram was quiet except for the turbine whine and the occasional radio check. Dalton flew the A-10 like she was apologizing to it for the abuse, gentle on the controls, smooth on the throttle. The aircraft had performed flawlessly as always. The Warthog was ugly, slow, and obsolete by modern standards, but it was honest. It didn't lie to you. It didn't quit. It just worked, and if you treated it right, it would bring you home. She ran through her post-combat checks, verifying systems, counting remaining ordnance. She'd expended most of her load good. Better to come home light than to leave Americans in the dirt. Her fuel gauge showed enough to make the pattern with maybe 5 minutes reserve. Tight, but manageable. The call came as she crossed into friendly airspace. Hog 11 Bagram Tower. You are cleared direct for recovery. Major Rains requests you report to operations immediately upon landing. Dalton's expression didn't change. Copy Tower. Hog 11 inbound. She knew what immediately meant. It meant she was about to have a very uncomfortable conversation about things like command authority and rules of engagement and why she thought she could freelance in a combat zone. It meant paperwork. It meant her commander was either going to write her up or hug her, and she honestly wasn't sure which would be worse. The approach was standard, the landing unremarkable. She taxied to her revetment, shut down the engines, and sat in the cockpit for a moment in the sudden silence. Her hands were steady. Her breathing was controlled. She'd done the right thing. She'd do it again. That would have to be enough. When she climbed down from the cockpit, her crew chief was waiting, a master sergeant named Kowalski who'd been turning wrenches longer than Dalton had been flying. He looked at the empty weapons pylons, the carbon scoring around the gun, and nodded slowly. Good hunting, Captain. Dalton pulled off her helmet, ran a hand through sweat-damp hair. 6 guys are going home to their families tonight. I'd say good enough. Kowalski grinned. Major's looking for you didn't sound happy. He never does. She walked toward operations with the gait of someone who knew the path well, had walked it before, would walk it again. The operations center was cooler than the flight line, artificially so, and the temperature change hit Dalton like a wall. Major Rains was waiting, and his expression was carefully neutral. That was worse than anger. Anger she could navigate. Neutrality meant he was thinking, and thinking meant reports, and reports meant her career was about to get interesting. Captain Dalton, take a seat. She sat. Rains studied her for a long moment. You want to tell me what happened out there? Dalton kept her voice even. 6 SEALs were pinned down. I had ordnance and position. I engaged. You had orders to hold for coordination. Sir, by the time coordination happened, those men would have been dead. Rains leaned back. You flew solo into an active firefight. You employed weapons without JTAC clearance. You ignored radio calls from this operations center. You put yourself and a multi-million-dollar aircraft at risk. Dalton said nothing. There was nothing to say. It was all true. Rains pulled out a folder, opened it. You also executed a near-perfect gun run under fire, delivered ordnance with 0 collateral damage, and extracted 6 SEAL team members who are currently filling out their after-action reports in terms that I can only describe as worshipful. He looked up. The gun camera footage is already making the rounds. By tomorrow morning, every pilot in theater is going to know your name. So I'll ask you again, what happened out there? Dalton met his eyes. I heard Americans dying, sir. I had the means to stop it, so I did. The silence stretched. Finally, Rains closed the folder. You're grounded pending investigation. Squadron commander's orders. You'll submit a written statement, surrender your flight authorization, and await further instruction. He paused. And Captain, that was some of the finest flying I've ever seen. Stupid, insubordinate, and completely against protocol, but finest flying. Dalton stood. "Understood, sir." She saluted, turned, and walked out into the Afghan sun. Grounded, she'd expected it, didn't make it easier. The A-10 sat in its revetment behind her, engine cowlings open while Kowalski performed post-flight inspections. It looked tired, scarred, beautiful, just like her. She joined the Air Force because she wanted to matter, wanted to be more than the girl from the Kentucky Hollow who fixed broken things. She'd found that in the cockpit, found purpose in the thunder of the GAU-8, found meaning in bringing people home. If that meant the end of her career, so be it. Some prices were worth paying. Rodriguez found her 2 hours later. The young SEAL was still in his kit, still smelling like gunpowder and fierce sweat, and he walked up to her with the kind of intensity that made senior NCOs nervous. "Captain Dalton," she turned. "That's me." He stuck out his hand. "I wanted to say thank you for what you did." They shook. His grip was firm, grateful. "Just doing my job," Dalton said. Rodriguez shook his head. "No, ma'am, that wasn't a job, that was—" He struggled for words. "That was someone who gave a damn. Most pilots, they wait for clearance, they wait for coordination. You just came." Dalton shrugged. "You needed help. I had bullets. Seemed simple. Staff Sergeant Holt wants to meet you. The whole team does. They're saying you flew through hell to get to us." She allowed herself a small smile. The A-10 was built for hell. I just pointed it in the right direction. But Rodriguez wasn't done. "They're calling you junkyard because that's what your call sign is, but after today, that name means something different. It means you take broken situations and fix them. It means you don't quit." The words hit harder than Dalton expected. She'd earned the call sign years ago in flight school, junkyard, because she could fix anything, because she flew like she was assembled from spare parts and sheer stubbornness. But hearing it reflected back with respect, with gratitude, made something tighten in her chest. "I appreciate that," she said quietly. Rodriguez nodded, started to leave, then turned back. "Captain, I got a daughter, 3 years old. Because of you, I'm going to see her again. I won't ever forget that." He walked away before she could respond. Dalton stood in the heat, feeling the weight of his words settle into her bones. That night the story spread. It moved through the chow halls and ready rooms, through the maintenance hangars and operations centers, told and retold until it took on the quality of legend. A single A-10, a solo pilot, 6 men saved. The details changed with each telling. Some said she'd flown through missile fire. Others claimed she'd been out of ammunition and made gun runs on fumes and fury alone. But the core remained constant. Captain Eliza "Junkyard" Dalton had broken every rule to do the right thing, and 6 Americans were alive because of it. In the SEAL team room, Holt was writing his after-action report with the kind of precision he usually reserved for target packages. He described the ambush, the tactical situation, the moment when hope had seemed like a luxury they couldn't afford. And then he described the A-10, the gun runs, the pilot who'd flown like she had a personal grudge against death itself. His hand hesitated over the keyboard when he reached the recommendations section. Then he typed, "Captain Dalton's actions were nothing short of heroic. Recommend immediate recognition for valor under fire." He knew it wouldn't be enough. Words never were, but it was a start. In her quarters, Dalton sat on her bunk and stared at the ceiling. Grounded. The word felt like a prison sentence. She joined the Air Force to fly, and now they were taking that away, even temporarily. But when she closed her eyes, she didn't see runways or regulations. She saw Rodriguez's face, saw that gratitude. The investigation took 3 days. 3 days of statements and interviews, of senior officers asking her to justify decisions she'd made in seconds, of trying to explain why she'd valued lives over protocols. On the afternoon of the 3rd day, she was summoned to the wing commander's office. Colonel Sarah Vickers was a fighter pilot from the old breed, someone who'd flown F-16s in the First Gulf War and had the kind of reputation that made junior officers stand straighter in her presence. She gestured for Dalton to sit, and there was something in her expression that Dalton couldn't read. "Captain, I've reviewed the investigation findings. I've read the SEAL team statements. I've watched the gun camera footage about 20 times. Vickers leaned forward. "You broke the rules. You violated direct orders. You put yourself at unacceptable risk." Dalton braced for what came next. You also demonstrated the finest combat airmanship I've seen in 15 years. You saved 6 lives. And you reminded everyone in this wing why we fly. Vickers slid a paper across the desk. Your flight status is reinstated, effective immediately. You'll receive a formal letter of counseling for the rules violation that's non-negotiable, but you'll also be recommended for the Distinguished Flying Cross. Dalton stared at the paper. Ma'am, don't thank me, Captain. Thank the SEAL team that went abat for you. Thank the gun camera that proved you hit exactly what you aimed at. And thank whatever God you pray to that. I understand the difference between stupid and necessary. Dalton returned to flight status the next morning. Her first mission brief was routine, show of force over a village in Helmand Province, nothing complicated. But when she walked into the ready room, every pilot stood. It wasn't protocol, it wasn't required, it was respect. Her squadron commander, Lieutenant Colonel Barnes, nodded to her. Good to have you back, Junkyard. She nodded, took her seat, and focused on the brief. But she felt it, the shift in how they looked at her, how they listened when she spoke. She'd crossed a line that most pilots only approached, and she'd come back with proof that sometimes the right thing and the authorized thing weren't the same. The mission went smoothly. The A-10 performed as it always did, steady and reliable. When she landed, Kowalski was waiting with a grin and a thumbs up. Looking good up there, Captain. Aircraft's ready for whatever you need. She clapped him on the shoulder. Keep her flying, Master Sergeant. We've got work to do. And they did. Over the next 2 months, Dalton flew 43 combat missions. She provided close air support for Army units in contact, destroyed Taliban supply routes, and turned the A-10 into something approaching folklore. Requests for her by name started coming through channels. Ground commanders wanted Junkyard on station because she didn't hesitate, didn't flinch, and didn't miss. Her reputation grew beyond Bagram, beyond Afghanistan. Back in the States, flight schools started teaching her gun run as an example of precision under pressure. But Dalton didn't feel like a hero. She felt like someone doing her job, day after day, in an aircraft that deserved better than the retirement rumors that constantly circulated. The Air Force brass wanted to retire the A-10 fleet, wanted to replace it with multi-role fighters that could do everything adequately instead of one thing perfectly. Dalton understood the logic. She just didn't agree with it. One evening, after a particularly long mission, she sat in the cockpit during post-flight and ran her hand along the instrument panel. The A-10 was scarred, dented, older than she was. It had been shot, patched, rebuilt, and sent back into combat more times than anyone could count. It was ugly. It was slow. It was everything modern warfare supposedly didn't need. But it was also honest, and it saved lives, and that had to count for something. Her thoughts were interrupted by a knock on the fuselage. She looked down to see a young Army sergeant, couldn't have been more than 22, standing with his helmet in his hands. "Ma'am, are you Captain Dalton?" She climbed down. "I am." The sergeant seemed nervous. "I was in that convoy you covered last week, the one that hit the IED near Sangin." Dalton remembered. 3 vehicles, 1 disabled, Taliban moving in. She'd put rockets and gun runs so close the ground commander had called her insane. But the convoy had made it out. The sergeant swallowed hard. "I wanted you to know that my buddy, Private Chen, he was in the disabled vehicle. You bought us enough time to get him out before they overran us. He's alive because of you." Dalton didn't know what to say. She never did in these moments. "I'm glad he's okay," was all she managed. The sergeant nodded, seemed like he wanted to say more, then just saluted and walked away. Dalton watched him go, feeling that familiar tightness in her chest. This was the job, not the medals or the recognition or the investigation boards. This. Knowing that somewhere Private Chen was going to go home, was going to have a life, was going to have a future, that was worth everything. She finished her post-flight checks and headed to the ready room. Inside, the squadron was gathered around a laptop, watching something. She caught glimpses of gun camera footage, heard the sound of the GAU-8. Someone noticed her and quickly closed the laptop, but not before she recognized the footage. It was her gun run from 2 months ago, the one that had started everything. Lieutenant Marsh, one of the younger pilots, looked embarrassed. "Sorry, Captain, we were just—" "It's fine," Dalton said. "Learn what you can from it." She grabbed a bottle of water and headed for her quarters. Behind her, she heard Marsh say quietly, "She doesn't even care that she's famous." Another voice, Captain Torres, responded, "That's why she is." Dalton kept walking. Fame was temporary. The only thing that lasted was the work, and the work was never finished. That night, lying in her bunk, she thought about home, about Kentucky, about her father's shop and the smell of engine oil, and the way he'd taught her that anything could be fixed if you understood how it worked and weren't afraid to try. The A-10 was like that. It was a machine that made sense. It was built around a gun, armored to survive, designed to come home even when it shouldn't. It was the aircraft equivalent of her father's philosophy, honest, tough, and reliable. Flying it felt like home. The weeks blurred into months. Dalton flew, maintained her aircraft, mentored younger pilots. She didn't seek attention, but it found her anyway. Journalists wanted interviews. Commanders wanted photo opportunities. She declined most of it. The work mattered more than the recognition. But she couldn't decline everything. The Distinguished Flying Cross ceremony was mandatory. She stood in dress blues while a general she'd never met pinned the medal to her chest and read a citation that made her sound like someone she didn't recognize. Words like extraordinary heroism and selfless dedication and inspiring courage. She stood at attention and thought about Rodriguez's 3-year-old daughter. That was the real citation. The ceremony ended. People shook her hand, congratulated her. She smiled, said the right things, and escaped as soon as protocol allowed. Outside, the Afghan sun was setting, painting the mountains in shades of amber and rust. The A-10s sat in their revetments, waiting, always waiting. Kowalski found her there. "Nice metal, Captain," she touched it briefly. "Feels heavy." "That's because it is." He pulled out a rag, started polishing a panel. "You heading out soon?" "Deployment ends in 6 weeks, then back to the States." "You going to miss it?" "The deployments, no, the flying." She looked at the A-10. "Always." Back in the States, the transition was harder than she'd expected. Davis-Monthan Air Force Base in Arizona was home to the A-10 fleet, and it should have felt like coming home. But the politics of military aviation had caught up with reality. The A-10 was still on the chopping block. Budget meetings and Pentagon briefings were determining the future of the aircraft, and by extension, the future of pilots like Dalton. She flew training missions, ran through procedures, and watched as Congress debated whether the Warthog was obsolete. The argument was always the same. The A-10 was old, single-mission, couldn't survive in a modern, contested environment. The counter-argument was simpler. It saved lives. Dalton was asked to testify before a committee. She almost refused. Politics wasn't her arena, but her squadron commander made it clear this wasn't optional. So she put on her dress uniform, flew to Washington, and sat in a room full of people who'd never been shot at discussing the value of the thing that had saved her life and countless others. "Captain Dalton," a senator began, "you're here because you have direct experience with the A-10 in combat. Can you speak to its effectiveness?" She could. She spoke about the titanium bathtub, the redundant systems, the gun that could destroy armor and save infantry. She spoke about flying low and slow, about being able to see the people you were protecting, about the difference between dropping a bomb from 30,000 feet and putting rounds exactly where they needed to go. She spoke about Rodriguez and his daughter. When she finished, the room was quiet. The senator nodded. "Thank you, Captain, that was illuminating." The hearing continued. Other people testified, budget analysts, procurement officers, strategists who'd never left the Pentagon. They had charts and projections and cost-benefit analyses. Dalton sat and listened and felt the weight of knowing that numbers on a spreadsheet would determine whether the aircraft that had defined her career would survive. The decision would take months. In the meantime, she flew. The A-10 community was tight-knit, a collection of pilots who'd chosen an unglamorous aircraft because it did one thing better than anything else: it brought people home. They trained together, shared stories, and quietly worried about the future. Dalton became something of an icon within that community, not because she sought it, but because her story represented what they all believed. The A-10 mattered. The mission mattered. One afternoon, she was invited to speak at the Air Force Weapons School. The audience was filled with the best pilots in the service, fighter jocks, bomber crews, special operations, and she stood in front of them feeling acutely aware that she was representing something larger than herself. "I'm not going to tell you that the A-10 is the best aircraft in the inventory," she began. "It's not the fastest, not the stealthiest, not the most advanced. But I will tell you this. When Americans are in trouble on the ground, when they're pinned down and scared and out of options, the sound they want to hear is the GAU-8 Avenger. Because that sound means someone is coming to get them. That sound means hope." The room was silent. She continued, describing missions, tactics, the reality of close air support. She didn't sugarcoat it, the danger, the difficulty, the split-second decisions. But she also didn't apologize for it. The A-10 was built for a specific mission, and it executed that mission better than anything else. When she finished, the questions came. Technical questions, tactical questions, ethical questions. She answered them all with the same honesty she brought to flying, direct, clear, unflinching. Afterward, a colonel from the fighter community approached her. "Captain, I've flown F-16s for 20 years. I always thought the A-10 was a relic." He paused. "You changed my mind today." Dalton nodded. "Sir, every aircraft has its place. The A-10's place is low and close, where the people who need us can see us." He shook her hand and walked away. Small victories. The fight for the A-10's future continued on Capitol Hill, in the Pentagon, in conference rooms where decisions were made by people who measured effectiveness in dollars rather than lives. Dalton returned to Davis-Monthan and her squadron. She flew, she trained, she lived with the uncertainty. Months passed. Then, on a Tuesday morning, the announcement came. The A-10 fleet would be partially preserved. Budget cuts would reduce the number of aircraft, but the platform would survive. It wasn't everything the community had hoped for, but it was enough. The aircraft would keep flying. The mission would continue. In the squadron-ready room, the reaction was muted celebration. Everyone knew this was a temporary reprieve, that the debate would resurface in the next budget cycle, the next Congress. But for now, they'd won. Dalton stood and looked at the younger pilots, lieutenants who'd chosen the A-10 despite knowing its uncertain future, who'd committed to an aircraft that didn't get the glory but got the job done. "We keep flying," she said quietly. "We keep training. We keep being ready. Because somewhere someone is going to need us, and when that happens, politics don't matter. Only the mission matters." They nodded. They understood. The years continued. Dalton made captain, then major. She took command of a squadron, mentored a new generation of pilots, and watched as the A-10 continued to prove its worth in conflicts around the world. Every time budget cuts were proposed, the same argument played out. Every time, the aircraft survived. But Dalton knew it wouldn't last forever. Eventually, the A-10 would be retired, replaced by something newer, more expensive, more politically palatable. That was the nature of military aviation. What mattered was the time between now and then and what they did with it. She flew until she couldn't anymore, until her eyes weren't quite sharp enough, her reflexes not quite quick enough. The day she turned in her wings was harder than she'd expected. She stood in the squadron commander's office, holding the small leather case that contained her flight authorization, and felt like she was losing part of herself. "Major Dalton, it's been an honor," the commander said. She nodded, not trusting her voice. Outside, the flight line was busy with the familiar sounds of aircraft and maintenance crews. The A-10 sat in their revetments, scarred and ugly and beautiful. She walked to her old aircraft one last time. Kowalski was there, older now, grayer, but still turning wrenches. He saw her and straightened. "Ma'am, Master Sergeant." She ran her hand along the fuselage. "Take care of her. Always do." He hesitated. "You know, in 30 years of maintaining these birds, I've worked with a lot of pilots. You were one of the best." "I had a good teacher," she said, meaning him, meaning the aircraft, meaning the mission. She walked away without looking back. Looking back would have broken her. Retirement was strange. Civilian life was strange. She took a job as a consultant, advising on close air support tactics, but it wasn't the same. Nothing was the same without the cockpit, without the mission. She moved back to Kentucky, to the hollow where she'd grown up. Her father was gone now, but the shop was still there, and she spent her days rebuilding engines and teaching local kids about machinery and problem-solving. It was quiet work, honest work. One afternoon, a young woman showed up at the shop, 18, maybe 19, with her father's eyes and a worn A-10 patch on her jacket. "Are you Major Dalton?" the woman asked. Now I'm just Eliza," the woman smiled. "My name is Sarah Rodriguez. My dad was Staff Sergeant Marcus Rodriguez. He died 3 years ago, IED in Syria. But before he died, he told me about you. About the day you saved his team, about how you taught him what courage looked like." Dalton's throat tightened. "Rodriguez, the young SEAL with the 3-year-old daughter. I'm sorry about your father," Sarah nodded. "He lived for 15 more years because of you. He saw me grow up. He walked me to school. He taught me to be strong." She pulled something from her pocket. "He wanted you to have this." It was a challenge coin, worn, carried, obviously treasured. On one side the SEAL trident, on the other an A-10 with the words, "Junkyard for those who refuse to quit." Dalton took it with shaking hands. "Your father was a good man." "He was, and he always said you were the reason he got to be my dad." Sarah paused. "I'm